Hello and welcome to the Circling the Bases podcast. I'm DJ Short, and with me here once again is Scott Pianowski from Yahoo. We are live on Twitch this afternoon, so welcome to our audience over there. And if you are listening in podcast form or watching later on YouTube, we're recording on Wednesday afternoon. Lots of afternoon baseball today, which is always fun. That means it's also time, though, for our weekly Waiver Wire Wednesday show. I'll bring you in here, Scott. As part of that, of course, we've been doing our pitch clock. Last week, we're open to adjustments, as Major League Baseball should be with all the changes they've made as well. We reduced our pitch clock to 40 seconds. So we will do that this week. I am on the clock this week, but the gist of the show here is we each bring 5 recommendations to the table. In leagues of various depths, more shallow leagues, 10, 12-team leagues, but also deeper ones as well. So hopefully all of our listeners can get something from today's show.
Yeah, give you a little retail therapy, right? Try to, if the players you have aren't doing it for you, try to get some new players, at least at the bottom of your roster, where you should always be churning.
Yeah.
And you mentioned daytime baseball. So when you think about daytime baseball, what team comes to mind? I think of the Chicago Cubs, who obviously for years didn't have lighting in their stadium. And they've recalled Christopher Morel, who was one of my favorite fantasy pickups of last year. I'm going to put you on the clock. He's on your list. Why don't you pitch us on Christopher Morel?
Yeah, so the Cubs brought up Matt Mervis last week, but Christopher Morel's numbers in the minors were even more impressive, hitting .330, had 11 home runs in just 29 games, also stole 4 bases. So about time he comes up here. He actually started at second base on Tuesday with Nico Hoerner out of the lineup with a hamstring issue. The Cubs have not put Hoerner on the injured list yet, but Morel should see some playing time at second base there in the coming days. He qualifies at 4 different positions in Yahoo: second base, third base, shortstop, outfield. A little bit flawed approach for sure, but last year put up 16 home runs, 10 stolen bases, so there's pop and speed ability here. I think he should be rostered in most mixed leagues right now.
I agree. The power he showed at AAA kind of came out of nowhere. He doesn't have a body type that really looks like a slugger, but the bottom line is he's going to fill different, even if the approach isn't ideal, he's going to fill different categories. And Chicago lineup has been a little bit more fun than expected. So I think it's certainly a good time to get in on him. And we love the position flexibility as well. And, get some extra daytime baseball. Nothing wrong with playing. It's easier to see in the daytime for most of these guys. So that could be a plus as well. Well, who do I have who plays some multiple positions? A bunch of these guys. I'm going to try to say something nice about Detroit. Okay. I talked about them being one of the worst teams in baseball. And for the first couple of weeks they were, man. They went to Tampa Bay, got their lunch eaten. And since then, the last month or so, they're in the middle of the pack in the runs scored category. And Eric Haase is somebody who he's rostered, 11% of Yahoo leagues or something like that. He's got a plus average right now. He's only got 2 home runs, but he's shown power in recent seasons. And if you look at his OPS plus the last 3 years, which is kind of a good back of envelope metric of how good an offensive player is, 103, 114, 112, or 100 is a league average player. He's a better than league average hitter. I'm actually in some leagues in Yahoo, one standard catchers. If one catcher is standard in Yahoo, I'm actually using Eric Haase because he plays a lot of times, first base, outfield, deeper leagues. I'm trying to get extra at bats. I'm not saying Detroit's lineup is going to be great, but I don't think it's going to be a bottom 5 lineup anymore. I think it just might, maybe the 19th best, the 23rd best, or something like that. I'm warming up to the fact that it might be more playable than I originally thought, and I think Eric Haase is underrepresented right now.
So Haase had, 7-game hitting streak, which came to an end on Tuesday night, but still hitting .393 this month. Hit homers in back-to-back games when the Mets were in town. Unfortunately, the Mets had to leave, so that home run streak ended as well. I just love making fun of the Mets right now. I'm gonna keep that going. Actually, I'm not. I have something positive to say about the Mets, also at the catcher position, and this is Francisco Álvarez. So he started off really slow. I think he was 1 for his first 15, but recently has started to turn things on a bit at the plate. Had his first 2 home run game on Tuesday against the Reds. He's hitting .308, 12 for 39 over his last 14 games. I still think he's going to struggle with the strikeout. There are times that he seems a little over aggressive. And I think after a night where he hits two home runs, maybe that'll happen a bit more here in the coming days. I think that's something to watch. But Álvarez was not just a top catching prospect, but one of the top overall prospects in the game. A very quick bat, light tower power. Just need a little bit of time to get comfortable at the major league level. Also, keep in mind he's catching a pitching staff which is in shambles right now for the Mets. So I think it made sense to give him a little bit of time to get comfortable. But I think any catcher that's producing, you mentioned Haase, but also Álvarez, like if he's getting comfortable against major league pitching, just ride it out and see what happens here. The Mets lineup, I don't think it's going to be as bad as it has been over the past couple of weeks or so. So I think it's a good time to jump on board with Álvarez.
We know the bat is world class. What has your impression been of his defense, and how will that allow him to get in the field as a catcher? And I'm not hip to this. I know you follow the Mets closer than I do. Have they been giving him non-catcher work?
I believe only here and there, not as much as you might think. Against left-handed pitching, they have Tommy Pham. They have Mark Canha, right-handed batters. So like the DH opportunities against lefties, not necessarily there. Álvarez has been surprisingly good for framing. He's in the 90th percentile for framing. So he's holding his own there. The pop time to second base is 73rd percentile. So that's not really an issue. And in general, I mean, teams are stealing like crazy. So I wouldn't say they're stealing on Álvarez as much as just teams are very aggressive stealing bases right now. But yeah, I think he's passing the eye test so far as holding on to a catcher position for the long term, which is a big deal from a fantasy perspective. Again, I mentioned a minute ago, like this Mets pitching staff is really bad right now, and we've seen what's going on with Max Scherzer. He got pushed back due to neck spasms. Who knows the next time he's going to pitch? They need Verlander to be the ace of this staff moving forward, because everything else is looking pretty rough right now. That's a tough situation for any rookie catcher to have to handle, but Álvarez can hit. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Man, I was really hoping that Peterson was going to pop this year. I was really excited when Senga got off to a good start. I'm looking for answers on this Mets pitching staff. I'm not sure I'm seeing them, but certainly Álvarez's bat has me excited. And we've talked a lot about Brett Beatty on this show too, and he looks like a guy who's here for good. LaMonte Wade's going to be my next play in San Francisco, and I think the only reason he's still able to be picked up in so many leagues is because he's a platoon guy. But look, it's a very clean platoon. He bats leadoff for the Giants against right-handed pitching. Obviously, most of the world is right-handed. So even though the Giants play those West Coast games, they can be a little bit of a pain in the neck for a part-time guy. At least when Wade's going to play. Right-handed starter, he's batting leadoff. 261, 438, 511 slash. I mean, that's slugging and on base is terrific. He's first base and outfield eligibility, and an even number of walks and strikeouts. You know how I feel about that whenever I see that.
Yeah.
Hugging strangers. So he's the best LaMonte since Sanford Sun. We're a very Sanford Sun friendly program. We talk about the theme song. We're going to give you LaMonte Wade. Not for every format. In the shallower formats, you need somebody who plays every day. I get it. Although Wade in very limited time has actually hit lefties this year. It's a really short sample though. But I think he's going to tear up righties. The San Francisco lineup is a little bit top heavy, but if he's batting leadoff, that's the place to be. So let's work on that LaMonte Wade ownership tag. I think it's a little bit low.
Yeah, 940 OPS against righties so far this season. Last year was a rough one for him, injuries and whatnot. But 2 years ago, had an 860 OPS against righties as well. If you're in a league where you can make daily lineup changes, I think he's pretty much a must as far as rostering. Before we move on here, just a reminder, download the RotoWorld app to receive breaking player news all season long. Stay ahead of the competition by favoriting players on your roster. Get the latest injury updates, player news, and much more delivered right to your phone. It's available in your app store today. So next up for me, I'm going to talk about someone I think I mentioned a few weeks ago, and that's Alex Kirilloff. I am a huge Alex Kirilloff fan, and currently he's available in more than 90% of Yahoo leagues. And we all know the story with Kirilloff. Former top prospect, at the time when he was coming up through the Twins minor league system, one of the top hitting prospects in the game. Of course, has had multiple wrist issues over the past couple of seasons, but on his minor league rehab assignment, he was great. Hit 316, had a 435 on base percentage, hit 3 home runs over 10 games in AAA. Initially, the Twins optioned him after his rehab clock expired, but he was called up late last week, and He hasn't done much so far fantasy wise. He's 1 for 5 with 4 walks in 3 games going into play on Wednesday. But the last 2 games, he's hit cleanup and fifth in the Twins lineup, starting at first base. Kirilloff is a guy in 2021. The numbers as a rookie were not super impressive, but the things that you did like was the quality of contact. He actually had an expected batting average of 295 as a rookie. The strikeout rate was very reasonable as well. Who knows the condition of the wrist? I don't think he's someone you're necessarily counting on, but middle of the Twins order, a left-handed batter, qualifies between first base and outfield, has that prospect pedigree. For me, I'm very willing to take a chance on him.
Yeah, you give him a pass for the wrist injury. He was the 15th pick in his draft class and just an age 25 season. So at any point, the light could go on for Kirilloff, and I think it's a good time to get on him before he does much. I mean, in the old days, you could wait. Okay, watch a week or two, see what he does. But now in competitive leagues, you need to get on this stuff before it happens. Once it's obvious to everybody, it's too late. So let's kick some tires on Kirilloff in the medium and deeper leagues. Very Yahoo available. Domingo German is somebody who I've talked up a lot on this show, but he's still under 50%. And I get it because the ERA is over 4, and we're just trained to see that and not trust it. His whip's under 1. And there's an old kind of school of thought with fantasy. I don't know if it's Ron Chandler who coined this or Todd Zola, or maybe it was you, DJ. At times I've tried to figure out who ran that baseball league that we did, that sim league. It was you. So maybe I'm not giving you the credit. It could be Joe Sheehan. I don't know, Bill James. When ERA whip don't tell the same story, I trust the whip. And German's throwing 4 pitches, 3 of them grade as plus pitches. He's really spiked his strikeout rate. I think it's 11 strikeouts per 9 right now. And some of the ERA estimators actually say his ERA should be a little bit lower, not microscopically low. And I get it's hard to reconcile. How can you have an ERA over 4 and a whip over 1? It doesn't make any sense. But the walk strikeout rate's really good. And again, he's got a medley of pitches. He's got 4 pitches. 3 of them are grading as plus pitches right now. I still think the Yankees are going to be a competitive team. Last place in the AL East, but they are over 500. The bullpen support, I think, will get better as they sort things out there. Domingo German, I'm just going to trust the walk strikeout rate. I'm going to trust the pitch mix. I think he's capable of being the rest of the season. What are we going to project? I would think like maybe a 3.5 ERA, a 110 whip or something like that. That's playable in most mixed leagues. Yeah,
that's pretty wild to see his whip be that high. Or the whip is better, or the ERA is 4.35, the whip is 0.94. That's pretty wacky. Like you do not see that very often at all. So yeah, I mean, take advantage of those outliers. Like the closest example I can find otherwise, that's this wide is Aaron Nola's ERA is 4.44. His whip is 1.13. That's pretty vast as well. But yeah, I mean, take a look at this kind of stuff because every once in a while you can find an outlier who's worth taking a chance on. And, German's out there in a bunch of leagues. So
some people might say with the case of Nola, and maybe it applies to German too, sometimes you see stats like this and the argument is, well, they're around the plate too much. Aaron Nola is so good with his control that batters are actually using it against him. Maybe he'd be better served to walk a few guys or hit a few guys or something like that. I guess it's a school of thought for that. Because some guys are always going to be those whip masters because they don't walk anybody. But with Nola, he's allowing too many home runs, and he's been one of the more frustrating aces this year. He's been okay. He got a win this week, which is nice, but he hasn't given you what your ADP would have expected from him so far. But
yeah,
so again, maybe for all I know, maybe somebody on Fangraphs or somebody somewhere has done a dive into these types of pitchers and what the disconnect is. Right. Some guys never meet their expected stats like their whole careers. So Dave
like
Bush
Michael Pineda. Michael Pineda was
like that. Dave Bush was a guy who people would talk about. Oh, his expected stats say he should be this much better, and his
Evaldi was that way for a while too.
For sure. And I think we've gotten better at not expecting everybody to have a regular home run rate. That shouldn't be maybe normalized. And maybe FIP and XFIP are telling us a little bit of a lie sometimes. But that said, German's on a bunch of my rosters. I'm not just telling you to pick him up. I've added him in a bunch of leagues this year. And I'm going to die on the hill of the walks and strikeouts. They look like a pitcher who's worth rostering. I'm going to roster him.
Yeah, and I think for a while, and this is kind of pre-Statcast, there was a line of thinking that like once a ball is put into play, like that, it's beyond a pitcher's control. Remember that? I think that the shifts are part of it, all that. Like, you can look at that if you want, but I think that school of thought is changing now. There are certainly pitchers who can pitch to softer contact versus those who give up harder contact. And
yeah, the introduction of BABIP and Forrest McCracken and all that was a great first step. And and the fact that he came up with an idea that was so counterintuitive, and some of the smartest people in baseball were like, this can't be right. It's like, well, wait, actually, it is kind of right. Well, is it right? It's right to some degree, but there's levels of it. We've gotten a lot more specific with stats, a lot more granular with stats, and there's so many. It's a golden age for stat analysis and the revolution stuff, but we have to be smarter with this stuff. Pitchers do have more control over it. At one point, the idea was that they have no control over it. It's just one big lottery, and we know now that that isn't true.
Right. And when you do look at fielding independent pitching and that sort of stuff, it's great if like a pitcher has a low FIP, but if their team's defense is bad, then it doesn't matter. And that's the way it is with the Phillies,
Right,
like
for sure.
Zach Wheeler has a high ERA, but his FIP is low, but that's kind of what happens when you.
It always feels like the Phillies have a team like a softball team, right? It's like, oh, whatever, we're going to outscore them. Their idea of defense is we'll score 9 runs, but it feels like they always have 2 or 3 DHs in the field, and it hurts now because Harper has to DH.
True. That
somebody like Kyle Schwarber has to have a glove when maybe he's best position is DH too.
Yeah, somebody asked me in a live chat yesterday, do you think that Schwarber being in the field could be impacting his hitting? And I don't know. I can't get in his head, but it's it's something to think about, I guess, at least. But
I always think about stuff like, again, we talk about what does defense matter, what does positioning matter? Does a player relax more if they're at a position they can handle, or they know they're playing one place every day? Is it taxing on a player if he's bouncing around the field? Some guys it may not be. Some guys it may be. One of my cases for Nick Senzel, who I've talked about on this show before and in the spot before, was that I thought maybe if the Reds just said, okay, you belong in this one spot, we're going to leave you alone, we're not going to jerk all around the field, maybe he could just focus on his hitting a little bit more. Or I talked about one year that Suarez was asked to be the shortstop for the Reds. It was a horrible position for him. He made like 7 errors in the first week. It felt like, did that affect his offense? There's never going to be, this is stuff you can't quantify, and I get it. It's a soft factor, Joe Sheehan would call it. And sometimes if you look at the clouds long enough, you'll see a pattern, right? I mean, some of this stuff is maybe some guys. Does a big contract put stress on a player? Does changing teams put stress on a player? Does defense put stress on a player? There's no one universal answer to this. Yeah. Maybe it's unknowable, and maybe I'm kidding myself to even look at this stuff, but I do look at this stuff.
Yeah, of course. It's all part of the puzzle here. Up next for me is a rookie pitcher at the Twins, Louie Varland. He is available in 87% of Yahoo leagues. This was as of Wednesday morning. Legit pitching prospect here with the Twins, 2.70 ERA over 253 innings in the minors, 323 strikeouts, 80 walks. Pitched well on Tuesday night. Twins lost again. They lost 3 in a row going into Thursday, but are going into Wednesday. But Varland was good. 6 innings and 1-run ball. Just that one hit was an RBI single, but he struck out 6, walked a pair, totaled 14 whiffs and 95 pitches. The velocity this year, compared to last year, we saw him in a small sample last year, but the velocity is up all across the board so far this year. He topped out last night, Tuesday night, at 98.5 miles per hour on his fastball. Has a varied arsenal too, 4 pitches in his arsenal: 4-seamer, cutter, slider, changeup. The path forward for Varland is a little tricky. He does get the Cubs on Sunday. The Cubs they're a pesky offensive team. Has another tough test after that. I'm blanking on which team it is, but the next 2 starts are not necessarily favorable. So I would be careful about where I use him. But given where he's rostered right now, and with Tyler Mahle sidelined, Kenta Maeda as well, he's going to get a chance to hang on here. And I know maybe he's getting a little bit lost in the shuffle of all these prospect pitchers who's come up recently, but I think Varland can stick.
I love that you're giving out 2 twins. It's a very twins-friendly podcast. Guys who were cut off from DJ's list were Matt Lawton, Joe Mays, Gary Ward, and Ken Landreau. So maybe in a future episode we'll get those guys in there. I hope you recognize some of those names. Ron Cooper,
I do.
Great Minnesota Twins.
Very good.
Is it crazy that the Metrodome came in the late '80s, in the early '80s? It's like already so many stadiums have come and gone in a short amount of time, right? Or the ballpark at Arlington, what was that, in the 90s park? That's already gone.
The Braves Stadium opened during the 96 Olympics. I mean, that is
wild, man. It's wild that stadiums are supposed to. You think of a stadium lasting like 100 years or at least 50 years. It's not always the case anymore. But
Nope.
I spent one winter in Minnesota. People there are very nice, and the fantasy picks are very promising, as DJ is outlining. I'm going to give you a player from the Washington Nationals, which doesn't sound like a lot of fun, but Lane Thomas, bad leadoff Wednesday as we go to press, 5th straight game. I know they're 27th in runs. I get it, but he's got a plus average right now. He's got a little bit of power, a little bit of speed. And since he joined the Nationals, his OPS plus is 110, so he's a plus offensive player. Yeah, it would be nice if we could pick up guys on the Braves or on the Blue Jays or on plus offenses, but you have to get what you can get. These guys are on the waiver wire for a reason. Sometimes it's the real estate. A player like Lane Thomas may not be rosterable when he's batting 7th, 8th, or 9th, but since they've moved him to the top of the lineup, I'm willing to excuse him for the fact that he plays with a bunch of guys who can't hit. And who knows, maybe Lane Thomas will be a pumpkin and he'll fall apart really soon. But I think he's been an underrated player since he joined the Nationals, and I'm willing to give him a spin as long as he keeps this spot at the top of the lineup.
And the sprint speed is 94th percentile with Lane Thomas as well. So getting that volume at the top could give you some stolen bases as well. So I'm into that. I'm feeling that too. I'm going to go back to the pitching side. And I just mentioned Louie Varland and how he's kind of undervalued among these prospect pitchers who have come up. But one name we haven't seen yet is Gavin Williams with the Guardians. He's currently available in 96% of Yahoo leagues. And yeah, the Guardians have had to rely on these young pitchers so far. Tanner Bybee, Logan Allen. Williams might be the best of the bunch. Had a great start Wednesday in AAA, facing AAA Louisville. The Reds AAA team is a very, very good lineup. Ellie De La Cruz, man, he could be here soon. He hit some of the the exit velocity on some of his hits Tuesday night were really insane. Definitely go check that out. But Gavin Williams actually struck out Ellie De La Cruz on Wednesday, struck out 10 batters, allowed 1 run in 5 2/3 innings. And even before going into the outing on Wednesday, let me see if I can pull up his ERA in the minors. So far this season, Gavin Williams going into Wednesday's action, after that start, 1.13 ERA, just dominant numbers. 41 strikeouts, 10 walks on the season, just has ridiculous stuff, bringing the velocity through a fastball Wednesday, 101.1 miles per hour, just bringing the heat there. The type of pitcher who can make a huge impact, sits in the mid to high 90s with the fastball, power slider, the curveball gets good reviews as well. I'm super intrigued. We might be, because Williams was promoted to AAA recently. The Guardians are right in the mix there in the AL Central. I think it's anybody's for the taking, given the injuries that the Twins have had in their rotation. I think the Guardians, they're playing to win this division, which they should be. I think it might not be long before we see Gavin Williams in the majors. Tristan McKenzie's going to be back soon too, so maybe that takes a spot away. But I think Williams can make a huge impact, and I would stash if you had a bench spot available.
Yeah, I like it. He turns 24 in July, 1st-round pick. Went to Cape Fear High School. What a crazy name for a high school. I don't even know what to say about that, but just what Cleveland needs, right, is another interesting pitching prospect. I mean, we've already seen a couple of young pitchers pop for them, and I still think this is the best team in this division, and maybe it's low-hanging fruit. I mean, the Royals aren't going anywhere. I said some nice things about the Tigers, but they're a 72-win team probably at best. White Sox, so many things have gone wrong for them. It feels like it's probably a 2-team race, and I think eventually the Guardians will come out and get it. And Gavin Williams, again, he's around the right age. He's got the 1st-round pedigree. He's got the strikeout stats that we want. Let's see the control maybe get a little bit better. Yep. But I think he could definitely be look. There's no guarantee with these guys, right? We've seen Brandon Pfaadt struggle with Arizona with his couple of starts, but some of these guys will hit the ground running and will be fantasy viable right away. And I think we have to be open-minded to what's possible. And, the first couple of starts don't go well, then maybe you need to reevaluate. I'll give you one more hitter to clean out my list. The Padres have started to come around. Juan Soto started to hit, so pick up Juan Soto if you can. But maybe you can't get Juan Soto. How about Ha-seong Kim, their shortstop, who got off to a really poor start. But the last 2 weeks, he's hitting 303. He's got 8 walks against 8 strikeouts. Again, I love it when those ratios are close to 1. Not many guys do that. He's stolen 5 bases over that span. He covers 3 infield positions. Eventually, at the end of the year, the Padres are going to have a top 10 offense. Now, Kim hits near the bottom of the lineup, so he doesn't get as much of a benefit from that as maybe he could. Although one injury, I think he has the profile he could easily bat first or second for these guys. Why isn't he better than Jake Cronenworth or something like that?
Right.
The bottom line is, guy, you're going to look, if you look at your stats full season, you think, oh, I don't want to pick up Kim, but he's trending upward. And I know you can get short sample size, arbitrary endpoints. Those things can lie to you at times, but I like that the approach is good. I like that this is a team that likes to run and they're letting Kim run. And remember, the change since the DH came to the National League, it used to be if somebody had stolen base possibilities, but they were batting seventh or eighth, they would never run because it's in front of the pitcher. They're going to bunt. That was the dead zone. Now you can run anywhere in a National League lineup. And we've seen even the middle of the lineup teams will run, but that's no longer a kill shot for speed guys. It used to be. I think Kim is going to be somebody who will easily outgrow this segment. He'll be well over 50% rostered in a couple of weeks when people realize that he started to come into his own this season.
Yeah, and he's another guy who brings some speed. He's selective at the plate. Doesn't make a lot of hard contact, so you wonder a bit about the power upside here. But I think he's one of those guys when it's all said and done. I think we've talked about this with Kim before. Like, it's kind of boring, but in the end of the year, like, the numbers are going to be there and they're going to be useful. So I wouldn't overlook him in mixed leagues for sure as a middle infielder type of option. We're not talking about starting at second or shortstop, but he will be viable, I think.
Totally agree.
So I think we've covered everyone. Does that seem right?
That's it. That's 10 guys. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing before we go, and I saw this come up with a couple of people this week. When you look at a baseball savant page and you see a bunch of red, what does that mean? You know, like, it's easy to look at that data and say, pick them up because their exit velocity is 90th percentile. But if you're not providing the context beyond that, like, how helpful is it? You know, this came up with Jack Sawinski. There was a debate on Twitter the other day where you're citing baseball savant page, but you're not looking at the whole picture of platoon splits and contact issues and all that. Where do you fall on, you know, using a baseball savant page as your justification and evidence for a pickup?
Well, again, as you said, it's one piece of the puzzle. It's something that we consider. The whole, you think about like the crux of Moneyball, right? And it was like scouts versus stats. And the point is you need both of them, right? You need some observations. You need some data collection. You need some framing of a team context. Where does somebody hit? What is their role on the team? Is this the team that likes to run? What's the ballpark? How does it play? What's the division like? Although the division schedules have been more balanced now, so that's not as significant a factor as it used to be. This is all part of it. And certainly going to Baseball Savant is something I do every day and something that you need to consider. Also, I think people also have to keep in mind, I think this gets lost sometimes. A lot of these stats overlap where they have certain things factor into multiple stats here. So sometimes someone will quote like 2 or 3 things about a player, but they're kind of double counting the same thing, right? I mean, if you have really good exit velocity and really good hard hit percent, those 2 things kind of go hand in hand. You're not going to have one and not have the other. So be careful that you're not double counting things sometimes. But
yeah,
and a lot of these stats are more maybe descriptive than they are predictive. We're still trying to figure out what augurs good for the future and what just explains what we've already seen.
Exactly.
The bottom line is this: you can't just be somebody who says, "Oh, I'm a scout. I don't care what the stats say. I'm just going to sit 5 rows behind the plate and watch what happens." Not that scouts. I think Moneyball, the movie, did a little bit of a poor job of making some of these scouts out like they couldn't tie their shoes or drive a car or something. I mean, a lot of these guys are really smart, but even the scouts would say, the best scouts would say, yeah, we need stats. And the best stat people would say, yes, we need to observe. And my fantasy ethos has always been that you get to mix all this stuff together. And again, it's going to be part of the team chemistry of how that mixes, where people hit, how good the lineup is, the ballpark, all this stuff I already said. This is all part of the puzzle. There's no one, and I mentioned OPS plus is a good shorthand. Some people might prefer different stats as some of the more statistically friendly stats. I like the index stats that 100 is the league average. It's just a nice back of envelope thing, but there's never going to be one stat. There's never going to be, okay, well, his WAR is this, pick him up, or his sprint speed is this, pick him up. It's all part of what goes into a really big puzzle. And that's what makes fantasy great, is that there's different ways to get to fantasy value. And some guys who strike out a lot and don't walk are still fantasy valuable. And some guys who walk a lot aren't fantasy valuable. And it's all part of why the game is interesting, because there's so many different paths to get to a player. So long story short, I want people to look at Baseball Savant and Fangraphs and stuff. Just don't use anything, and don't use us. Don't use us as a Bible either. We are one thing to consider as you make your own intelligent final decision.
Yeah, no, I think that's well said. A lot of these numbers we see on Baseball Savant are not predictive at all. It's only what's happened to this point. So you can't see what will happen next. But I think you would rather have someone displaying this ability to make hard contact. The speed is something that can be measured and obviously indicates toward future production. But it's not everything. And I think it's better than 5 years ago, where we had BABIP and we had fly ball rate, we had line drive rate, but you were still kind of in the dark a bit more. So I think having this additional evidence only makes it more helpful, especially when you're talking about players on the fringes, or maybe players who have changed their approach to be more fly ball oriented or pull heavy and all that kind of stuff. So I think you can state certain percentiles and all that, but it's not the full story. And I would say it's helpful to give it in these little sound bites and say this about certain players when you're doing a podcast, but it's not the whole story.
For sure. And of course, to really get reliable baseball data, you need big samples. And this is the tricky thing about fantasy, is we have to make choices on very limited samples. And sometimes the samples don't have any value at all. And again, I'm talking about, what Kim's done the last 2 weeks. Some people will just scoff and say, well, who cares? It's 2 weeks, and I get it. We're dealing with a game of incomplete information. And then just to throw a wrench into it, sometimes pitcher stats won't make any sense, and a pitcher's struggling. And then at the end of the year, they'll say, oh yeah, my elbow started barking in May. Or
right.
I hurt my shoulder. I hurt my shoulder in that start in Tampa Bay, and I wasn't the same since. It doesn't make any sense for any athlete to really tell us about their being hurt or their health or everything. They're trying to protect their livelihoods and everything, and maybe it's none of our business and all that stuff. So we're playing a guessing game, and that's why pitchers are so frustrating and so maddening. Because even when good pitchers, they don't pitch well for a few starts, you have to get nervous. I mean, I took Corbin Burns early in some leagues. He hasn't been Corbin Burns so far. And you're like, oh, is his velocity down? Is there a pitch that's bothering him? Is he not clicking with the catcher? I don't know. Maybe it's just it certainly could be variance. That's a big part of it. I don't know if there's anything going on in his personal life. I mean, maybe everybody gets hit sometimes. It's part of it. Garrett Cole will allow 7 runs in one of his starts this year. It's just part of the game. But it's also what makes the game great too, because you're never going to figure it out. You're never going to solve it. No matter how much Bill James you read, how much Fangraphs you read, how much time you spend on Savant. I'll also mention and maybe you could give me your favorite go-to on Savant. I love to look at the expected stats. I love to know if somebody's hitting for a surprisingly good average or surprisingly good ERA, how much of it they earned with that. Now, granted, with any outlier stat, usually it's going to say, oh, they're not this good. If somebody has a 1.818 ERA, the expected stats going to be, well, their ERA should be 2.3 or something like that. That's commonly what you're going to get. But one of my favorite things to look at with Savant is the expected stats. What's one of the first things that you gravitate towards?
Yeah, I used to be that way, like on Fangraphs too, and you could see the difference between, batting average on balls in play, like who was the lowest, or even with pitchers, you could sort xFIP from ERA and all that kind of stuff. It helps you around the margins when you're looking for a player to trade for, or a player to maybe trade a little bit higher on, like Brandon Marsh right now, for example. He's hitting 317, but his expected batting average is 236. Like, just something like that gives you like this small little snapshot of information where you could say like, huh, interesting. Maybe he's overperformed a little bit. Maybe I should ask around or whatever. I mean, it's not everything, but it's a little bit of information that you're getting that you can use to your advantage. And sometimes that's what fantasy's about.
And full disclosure, as I mentioned on Monday's show, I used the expected stats from Paul Goldschmidt last year to talk myself out of drafting Paul Goldschmidt this year, which looks like a horrible mistake, even though the Cardinals are having one of their worst seasons. I don't know if they're going to – let me put your feet to the fire. At the end of the season, how many wins will the Cardinals
have? 85.
Will they be a playoff team?
No.
I think the hole's a little too deep. Not that they can't climb out of it. This is a division that's ripe to be taken. Nobody's great there, but yeah, I think I would say maybe 81 wins and no to the playoffs. Although I don't know, maybe they just need a different voice there. And I know managerial changes in season a lot of times are just changes for the sake of doing something. Maybe it's not the right move, but Ollie Marmol is given such a weird vibe. We've talked about this on the show before. I just think he's the wrong guy at the wrong time. This Contreras story is just wild that you would spend all this money on a guy and then, oh my God, we don't like his defense. Well, last I checked, the Cubs were on your schedule plenty in the last, 5 or 6 years. You should know what he could do defensively. But
how many games did the Mets win? How many games did the Mets win? If you had to guess right now.
Oh, I still think they make the playoffs. 87 wins.
Okay. At this point, I would take it. The thing about the Mets is it's New York, so you're going to hear a lot of frustration naturally, especially because just how poorly they've played recently. But they just need to get in the playoffs. Make sure that Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander are healthy. That's it. If you get in, like we saw with the Phillies last year, if you get in, you have this core of star players, you can go far. So if they don't win the division, who cares? Just get to the playoffs and let's see what happens.
It's a tournament. I just dialed up the Fangraphs playoff odds. And the Cardinals right now are 24.6% to make the playoffs. The Mets are still a plus bet to make the playoffs at 56.9%. The Braves are basically already in at 99.5. Mets are 56, Phillies 44, Marlins 19. Of course, the Nationals are just about effectively 0. But interesting that the Cardinals are still the second choice in that division. The Brewers are 66%. Then it's the Cardinals, Cubs, Pirates, and the Reds are buried. Rockies are at 0. Athletics are at 0. I think everybody would agree with that. The Twins are the 71% choice to make the playoffs in the Central. The Guardians are 25.3%. That looks low to me. I think the Guardians are going to figure it out, and they're only two games behind right now. I don't know. Maybe there's somebody we could punch up as a prop. Yankees 68.4%, which is interesting. The Orioles are the lowest in the AL East. They're 30.4%. This is just again something. It's something it's based in data. You may disagree with it. You may have reasons that aren't data driven that disagree with it. It's just one thing that makes it fun. But as you said, the tournament, the playoffs, man, as they keep adding more and more teams to it, it just means the variance is greater and greater. And what the World Series tells us, it tells us who won the tournament. It doesn't necessarily mean who was the best team. I've accepted that from long back. Yeah,
Cardinal Devil magic. It will come back at some point. We all know it. So we'll see. I think the Cardinals are too good to be this bad. So we'll see what happens. But
let me throw you one other small sample, just funkiness. And again, what does 15 games mean? You know who the worst offense is over the last 15 games in baseball? Because it's a good team. I forget if I went by run scored or OPS. I went by one of those two things. So again, there's different ways to measure this, and maybe one stat isn't better than another one. But I believe the Astros had the worst OPS over the last 15 days.
Wow.
I kind of see it, right? Other than Álvarez, Tucker's been okay. Álvarez has been great. Bregman's been disappointing. They obviously lost Altuve. They'll get him back. It's not usually the Astros were 1 through 9 were a lineup of hell, or 1 through 7 were a lineup of hell. I don't feel like they're right now. I feel like you work around Álvarez and Tucker, and it feels like everybody else you can pitch.
It's true. It's definitely true. The Yankees have 11 runs on the board through 6 innings today, so that's a good sign for them moving.
And the Tigers are 5. I told you this Tigers lineup was coming around. I don't think Haase played today, but man, a guy who Eduardo Rodriguez was a player I was afraid to draft, and it's looking like that was the wrong call.
Yeah, totally. He's looked great, and we'll see if he ends up being a trade chip. I think he could be. I think he can also opt out of his contract after the season, which might be a good idea for him based off of how he's pitching right now. But good stuff on this Waiver Wire Wednesday. Remember to subscribe to Circling the Bases wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, be sure to rate and review if you like what you're hearing. Also, follow us on Twitter if you don't already. Scott is at Scott_Pianowski on Twitter. I'm at DJ Short. Take care, everyone. We'll see you next time.